talk is scheduled for 4:20. I'll just wait maybe 3 more minutes here or so just to be sure that we're starting it on time. And then we will continue on. Well, our next speaker is Megan Figura. Did I say that right?
Figura.
Figura, okay. Megan is working towards her master's degree at South Dakota State University, and she's going to talk to us today about looking at avian use of cover crops in the Corn Belt. Go ahead, Megan.
Hello, everyone. I am a second-year grad student with South Dakota State University, and I'm here today to talk to you guys about my thesis, evaluating avian use of cover crops in the Corn Belt. This is really a very significant field of study, the results of which are needed to advise best management practices for the future of land management in the Corn Belt region. I'm also really very passionate about it, and I hope by the end of my talk, I can show you why. For a little bit of background, before we can talk about agriculture, we first need to talk about grasslands in North America. Historically, grassland was the largest ecosystem in the continent and also the dominant form of land cover, spanning 1.5 million kilometers. Over half of this was tall grass or true prairie, and since European settlement, 94 to 99% of that prairie has been lost or modified, representing the greatest loss of any ecosystem. It's estimated that 87 to 99% of that prairie loss is due to agricultural conversion alone. Grasslands are globally the most endangered terrestrial biome and are the most modified and least threatened. As you can see here, at the heart of what was the historic range of prairie is now a region known as the Corn Belt. The Corn Belt is a region noted for its extremely high volume of agricultural productivity and is the world's largest source of soybeans and accounts for over 1/3 of the world's corn supply. Today, 84% of modern grasslands are privately owned, and this really highlights the need for best management practices in privately owned lands and doing everything we can to increase conservation practices among private landowners. Remaining grasslands are predominantly working lands, lands that are being put to active human use and no longer consist of native grasses. Many bird and wildlife species have come to rely on the artificial habitat associated with these working lands, and altered management practices in the last 70 years have undermined the suitability of this habitat and degraded the ecosystem services that they can provide for these dependent grassland birds and wildlife. Natural resource conservation has never been more crucial, and sustainable agriculture is a form of resource conservation that will help restore some of the ecosystem services for this dependent wildlife and birds. Agricultural practices that best emulate natural habitat are going to be those most beneficial for dependent species. Cover crops are a re-emerging practice in sustainable agriculture that are thought to provide some of these ecosystem services that are otherwise lacking in agroecosystems. Cover crops are defined as crops grown for the primary purpose of maintaining soil health between periods of typical crop production by extending the period of plant growth and vegetative cover beyond the conventional cropping season and reducing what would otherwise be a fallow period. Cover crops have been studied extensively for their agricultural benefits and are known to provide various abiotic ecosystem services in intensely managed cropland systems. Some of these services include, but are not limited to, increased soil organic matter, reduced erosion, provision of weed and pest suppression, increased soil aeration, water infiltration, and improved nutrient cycling. What is less known is the relationship between wildlife, birds, and cover crops. Despite all of these many accepted agricultural benefits, the possibility for further ecological benefits, such as breeding habitat for birds, is poorly understood. And this is simply due to lack of study. There are a lot of efforts currently underway, but this is a really budding field of research, and a lot more work is needed for us to determine the relationships and what we can do to manage cover crops and the best way to maximize benefits for dependent birds and wildlife. Cover crops are often promoted as being beneficial for birds and wildlife, but as of yet, there is little supporting evidence just due to this lack of study. Some recent studies looking into the relationship between wildlife and cover crops have found that they might restore such ecological services as deterrence of pest insects, provision of floral resources for pollinators, enhancement of reptile and amphibian abundance, and enhancement of arthropod density within cover crop fields. But the benefits to other wildlife, especially birds, in intensively managed agriculture is still poorly understood just because more study is still needed. And that brings me to the big point in my talk, grassland birds. Many birds are dependent on North American grasslands, and grassland birds especially are experiencing a more extreme, consistent, and geographically widespread decline than any other avian guild. It is a modern conservation priority that we maximize grassland management in a way that we maintain grassland management in a way to maximize benefits for our avian populations. And with a sound understanding of the habitat requirements of grassland birds, it should be possible to support their populations on our working lands. And this brings me to the purpose of my study. The goal of my study is to evaluate avian use of cover crops relative to perennial cover, in my case, mainly CRP lands, and row crop systems in southeastern Iowa. Emphasis in my project will be placed on avifauna identified by the Iowa State Wildlife Action Plan as species of greatest conservation need. ISWAP defines species of greatest conservation need as those species whose populations are rare, declining, or vulnerable within the state of Iowa. There are 78 SGCN classified as breeding or potentially breeding in the state, and a further 34 considered non-breeding that may rely on important habitats in Iowa during their migration. Now, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about some of the SGCN that I've encountered so far in my study. So I have here, beginning from the top left, dick thistle, bobolink, grasshopper sparrow, eastern meadowlark, and field sparrow. I just want to talk to you a little bit about background to try to highlight how much of conservation priority these species really are. And to do so, I'm using breeding bird survey data from a survey period of 1966 to 2015. So starting with the dick thistle, we can see that it's pretty abundant in Iowa, but the overall trend for the 50 years of this study has been negative, only slightly negative, but still negative. Whereas in the last 10 years of this study, so 2005 to 2015, the trend has been slightly positive, but it's non-significant with a really wide confidence interval. So while these species may not be considered rare, they're still overall declining and considered vulnerable, which is why they're listed as SGCN under ISWAP. My next species here is the bobolink. They're moderately abundant in parts of their range, but not very much so in Iowa, so they kind of meet that rarity criterion. And you can also see here that they've had a moderately negative trend throughout the duration of their survey. And so, I can't state enough, we need to keep monitoring these populations to determine their status, determine what's affecting their population trends, and what we can do to conserve these species the best. The next species I have here is a grasshopper sparrow. It is somewhat abundant in the western end of its range, but it's pretty rare in Iowa, meeting that SGCN criterion. It's had a pretty significant negative trend in the duration of the study, so it meets that declining trend as well and is very threatened in this area. So this is another species that we just need to dedicate a lot of energy into if we're going to maximize conservation efforts for grasshopper sparrows. And here we have the eastern meadowlark. You can see by the map, it actually is fairly abundant in Iowa. And you can also see by the population trends for the duration of this 50-year survey, they're actually somewhat positive, even though non-significant with wide confidence intervals. So it's not meeting the rarity criterion and it's not meeting the declining criterion, but it is still considered vulnerable in the state. And we don't have enough certainty on the population trends. So we need to keep monitoring them to determine with greater certainty their actual status, what's affecting their status, and what we can do to keep improving the population abundance so that we can actually remove them from the SGCN list. Finally, I have here a field sparrow, which you can see is kind of moderately abundant in Iowa, but it still has a declining trend for the entire 50 years of the study. So it meets 2 of the 3 criteria for SGCN. And again, for the last time, I'll state, it's just really important that we keep monitoring these species so we can track how they're doing, what's affecting them, and what we can keep doing to maximize management benefits for them. So back to my project, I am conducting my study in Washington County, Iowa, where breeding birds and cover crops are suitably abundant. Iowa is the leading agricultural producer in the Corn Belt region, and while not yet meeting the 50% adoption rate promoted by the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, Washington County has one of the highest rates of cover crops planted per acre and also some of the highest diversity of cash crops planted in the county, which makes this the ideal area for the best insight into what a modern landscape would look like with increased cover crops. Now on to my study objectives. The study objectives for my project are split into two tasks. The first task is to develop a relative index of avian use with respect to cover type and to evaluate the relative influence of site and local factors on avian use with respect to cover type. Now remember, for me, cover types are perennial grasses, row crops that were seeded with cover crops the previous season, and then row crops that were not seeded and are just strictly cash crop fields. The results of this task will be used to build planning tools to help advise future conservation planners, farmers, and biologists alike. The second task for my study is to develop estimates of relative abundance and density of observed avian SGCN, and then to evaluate the relative use by SGCN with respect to management, habitat characteristics, and other factors at multiple spatial extents. Results from this task will be used to promote best management practices that maximize benefits to avifauna and SGCN in cover crop systems throughout Iowa and the rest of the Corn Belt region. I expect to find at the end of my study that cover crops will be beneficial for avifauna and that they will be so by emulating more natural habitat and restoring ecosystem services that would otherwise be lacking in an intensively managed agroecosystem. Some of the benefits cover crops may provide would be provision of breeding habitat for birds, roosting sites, nesting habitat, or increased food abundance. And so to talk about some of the methods I'm using, I'm starting off with avian point count surveys. This will allow me to evaluate species presence absence among fields and across cover types, as well as abundance, richness, community composition, and diversity. I'm also conducting nest searching and nest monitoring for further insight into population demographics and habitat use. This will also allow me to assess habitat requirements, nesting success, productivity, and hopefully, given a large enough sample size, population viability. I will also be monitoring vegetation amongst my fields in order to quantify various vegetative attributes and compare vegetative profiles among study fields and across cover types. So I will do so by measuring vegetation density, plant height, vegetative composition, cover class frequency, and litter depth. The significance to litter depth is it's both a foraging and nesting substrate for grassland birds. Additionally, I will be sampling ground-dwelling invertebrates in my study fields, and this is especially important because while grassland species are granivorous, during their breeding season, they'll have up to a 50% dietary shift towards insectivory, as it provides a higher quality food source for nestlings. So in order to index food abundance in my fields, I will be measuring invertebrate density, as well as richness, community composition, and diversity. Finally, I will be taking soil samples in my fields and submitting them to ward laboratories for what is called the Haney soil health test. This will return various metrics of soil health, such as soil respiration, carbon content, and mineral composition. This will also provide a Haney soil health score, which is an objective index for comparing overall soil health among study fields and across cover types. I will also be evaluating landscape context using multi-scale spatial analysis by looking at the relative influence of multiple cover types at various extents. This is especially important because grassland birds are highly sensitive to land cover and land composition in their patch areas, and this will really give us insight into their habitat use and selection. Analyses for my data results will be potentially analysis of variance with post hoc mean comparison tests in order to assess the relative use of cover type with respect to habitat characteristics, management, and related factors. I will then use information theoretic-based modeling using Akaki's information criterion adjusted for small sample size in order to evaluate the relative influences of cover type and various habitat characteristics and factors at multiple spatial extents. The significance of my results will be to elucidate the relative impacts of cover crops on avifauna and SGCN, and the results of my work will be used to advise best management practices in order to maximize benefits for these sensitive species in the Corn Belt region and to provide planning tools for their future conservation. This project is supported by the NRCS and is also conducted parallel to a project by Iowa State University looking at the relationship between cover crops and upland game birds. I would also like to take a moment to thank landowners in Washington County that have given me access to their properties to conduct my study. And I would like to thank the contributions of my advisors, Dr. Joshua Stafford, Dr. Christelle Baker, and Dr. Casey Jensen. And I would also like to thank you for taking the time to listen to me and sharing your interest with something I'm really passionate about. I hope now you share a little bit of my excitement. And with that, I will gladly take any questions.
Thanks, Megan. Any questions out there?
I have a question here. So how are you going to differentiate your cover crop fields? Some in South Dakota, at least, are season long. Some were planted in the spring, some in the fall, some are grazed, some are not. Or do you take those variables into account?
I guess I did kind of skim over a little bit. I'm looking specifically at fall seeded cover crops. And so they're not really managed in any other way. I am doing a landowner survey to look at seeding rate and planting date, for example, but there's no grazing management. They're all fall seeded. And so far, all the landowners that I've gotten permission from are using exclusively cereal rye or winter wheat. So those are the only factors I really need to consider.
So they will be seeding crops into these cover crop fields?
Mm-hmm.
Spring, okay.
In the fall. They'll be seeded in the fall.
But the following spring, they will be planting corn or soybeans into the standing cover crop, correct?
Right. Sorry, correct.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Doesn't sound like it. Well, thank you very much, Megan, for sharing your research with us.